stop all the clocks, cut off the telephone, prevent the dog from barking with a juicy bone.
You know exactly where that's from.
I do. And if you're listening, you probably do too. You're picturing a very, very specific scene in a movie. It has to be 4 weddings and a funeral, right?
It has to be.
The character reading that devastating poem, it tears your heart out. It's one of those cinematic moments that really, really sticks with you forever.
It absolutely is. And for millions of people, that was their front door into the world of W.H. Auden. It actually sparked this massive resurgence in his popularity back in the mid-90s.
Which is incredible for a poet who'd been dead for 20 years at that point.
It's unheard of. But here's the thing about Auden, and this is what we're going to get into today. That poem, Funeral Blues, is just the tiniest tip of a very large and very complicated iceberg.
Right.
And honestly, the man who wrote it might have been surprised and maybe even a little bit annoyed that it became his defining pop culture moment.
That's what I find so fascinating, because when you actually look at the stack of research we have here, and it's pretty substantial, you realize that W.H. Auden wasn't just a guy who wrote beautiful, sad poems.
Not at all.
He was a figure just defined by these massive radical contradictions. We are talking about someone who contains multitudes, and I mean that in the most literal sense.
He really was a 20th century giant, but a giant with 2 heads, you could say. Metaphorically speaking, of course.
2 heads, I like that.
You've got the Englishman who becomes a passionately American citizen. You've got the left-wing political icon of the 1930s who, later in life, rejects politics almost entirely for religion.
And my favorite detail, the man who lived in absolute squalor.
Oh, the stories are incredible.
We're talking physical chaos,
Yes.
cigarette ash everywhere, just a complete mess. But he was obsessively, rigidly punctual.
To the minute. It's a paradox that tells you so much about him.
It really is. It's the kind of character detail that a novelist would invent. And, usually when we do these deep dives, we try to simplify things, to find a single thread. But today, I think our mission is a little different. We're going to lean into the complexity. We want to figure out how a boy from York, who started out wanting to be a mining engineer of all things, became the enfant terrible of English poetry.
Yeah.
And then eventually the undisputed master.
And we have to get into the controversies. We can't avoid them. We're going to unpack what was called the Great Betrayal of 1939.
Which sounds like a spy thriller.
It does, doesn't it? But it was a literary scandal that nearly broke his reputation in Britain. And we also have to understand why, later in life, he tried to delete his own most famous poems from history. He literally wanted to erase them.
It's an incredible thing.
The poet Joseph Brodsky, a Nobel laureate himself, said Auden had the greatest mind of the 20th century. And I think by the end of this, we'll start to see why that isn't just hyperbole.
I can't imagine that in the internet, age trying to delete something that's already gone viral. But, okay, before we get to the deletion of history, let's start with the making of it. Let's go all the way back to the beginning. 1907, York, England. What did the world look like for a young Wystan Hugh Auden?
Well, to really get Auden, you have to start with the atmosphere of his home. His father, George Augustus Auden, was a very distinguished physician, a professor. His mother, Constance, had trained as a missionary nurse. So you have medicine and service right there at the center.
A very respectable middle-class background.
Very. But the key here isn't just their professions. It's the spiritual texture of the household. It was a high Anglican household.
Okay, let's unpack that term, high Anglican.
Yeah.
For people who aren't steeped in the nuances of English church history, does that just mean they were very devout?
It's more specific than that. It refers to a particular style of worship. High Anglicanism, or Anglo-Catholicism, places a huge emphasis on ritual, on liturgy, on the whole aesthetic experience of the service.
So less about the sermon and more about the show.
In a way. You're talking about incense, chanting, elaborate robes or vestments. It's a very sensory, very theatrical experience. Auden himself traced his love of music and language directly back to those childhood church services.
I can see that.
That solemn chanting, the rhythm of the liturgy, it gets into your bones when you're a child. He said later that to understand his poetry, you have to understand that he grew up thinking of the church service as a form of high drama. It trained his ear.
It trains your ear for meter and cadence before you even know what poetry is.
Yeah.
And I saw something in the notes about an Icelandic connection. He believed his family was from Iceland.
Yes, that was his father's pet theory. George Auden was convinced the name Auden came from the Old Norse name Auden.
Was it true?
Probably not. The evidence is pretty thin. But it didn't matter. For a young, imaginative boy like Whiston, it gave him this whole personal mythology to latch onto.
He's a secret Viking.
Exactly. He became obsessed with Norse sagas, with the Eddas, with these stark, cold, mythical landscapes of the North. It added this layer of ancient, heroic mystery to his very proper English upbringing.
I love that. But here's the part that really surprised me in the research.
Yeah.
He didn't set out to be a poet. Not at all. Until he was about 15, he was dead set on becoming a mining engineer.
It's such a specific, gritty ambition, isn't it? It seems completely at odds with the man we think we know.
It does. I mean, what's the connection between writing sonnets and digging for lead?
It makes a strange kind of sense when you look at what he called his sacred landscape. He spent his holidays in the Pennines in northern England. This is a rugged limestone area, and at the time, the lead mining industry there was in its final stages of decline.
Okay.
And he was obsessed with it. The decaying machinery, the abandoned mine shafts, the strange names of the villages like Rookhope. He didn't just see them as industrial ruins. He saw them as emotionally resonant. He felt something spiritual there.
So while other kids are dreaming of being, I don't know, train conductors or soldiers, he's dreaming about rusty pit-winding gear.
Precisely. He found something numinous in it, a word he used a lot, meaning spiritually charged. There's a later poem of his, Amor Loci, which means love of place, where he revisits this obsession. It's almost as if he took that fascination with the underground, with digging into the earth for hidden things, and just transferred it from mining rocks to mining the human subconscious.
That is a perfect analogy, digging into the earth versus digging into the mind. And speaking of the mind, his father's library was a huge influence too. Auden was reading psychoanalytic literature from a very early age, wasn't he?
He was. His father was a physician, remember, and very intellectually curious for a provincial doctor. He had books by Freud, by Grodek, by other early psychoanalysts.
So you have this young boy steeped in high church ritual, obsessed with industrial decay, and reading about the Oedipus complex.
It's a unique cocktail, isn't it? That's the formula that makes Auden. He was diagnosing the neuroses of the human condition before he could even vote.
So when does the switch finally flip? When does he go from, I want to design mine shafts, to, I want to write poetry?
It happened at his boarding school, Gresham School. It's 1922. He's about 15 years old. And it wasn't some grand dramatic moment. A friend of his, a boy named Robert Medley, just casually asks him one day, "Do you write poetry?"
And that was it, just a simple question.
According to Auden, that was the catalyst. He said that until that moment, the thought had never seriously crossed his mind. But as soon as Medley asked, he knew instantly that his true vocation was poetry.
Wow. It's one of those strange moments where someone else sees something in you that you haven't quite admitted to yourself yet.
Exactly. And once that dam broke, he just started writing voraciously.
Yeah.
And interestingly, around the same time, another major shift happens. He loses his religious faith.
Was it a dramatic, angry rebellion? You know, storming out of the chapel, denouncing God?
Not at all. And this is so typically Auden. It wasn't a crisis. It wasn't a rebellion. He just sort of realized he'd lost interest.
He drifted away.
It was a gradual realization, as he put it. The church of his childhood just didn't seem relevant to his new intellectual and emotional interests. He was discovering science. He was discovering his sexuality. And he was also discovering his flair for performance.
But we have to talk about the school play. The Taming of the Shrew, 1922.
Yes.
Where he played Katharina.
A fiery female lead.
That's the one. And there's this wonderful review from the school newspaper at the time that noted that despite wearing a poor wig, Auden managed to infuse considerable dignity into Katharina's passionate outbursts.
I love that detail. Poor wig.
It's a funny little anecdote, but it's actually quite telling. It foreshadows something important in his work. Auden always had this ability to mix the absurd, the bad wig, the chaotic apartment with absolute seriousness and dignity. He was never afraid to look a little bit ridiculous in the pursuit of a deeper truth.
Okay, so he graduates from Gresham's, he's found poetry, he's lost his religion, and now it's off to Oxford. This is where the legend of the Auden group really begins, right? This is where we have to be a bit careful with the history, because the Auden group is half fact, half media invention.
Okay.
So he goes to Christ Church, Oxford, and there he meets Stephen Spender, Cecil Day Lewis, and Louis MacNeice.
Basically the Mount Rushmore of 1930s English poetry.
Essentially, yes. And the media and later literary critics absolutely loved lumping them all together. They were seen as the single entity. There was even a mocking portmanteau for them later on. McSponday?
Pixponde. That sounds like a terrible brand of Scottish whiskey.
It does, doesn't it? It was a blend of their names, McNeice, Spender, Auden, Day-Lewis. And the idea was that they were this monolith of left-wing, anti-establishment, modernist views.
But they weren't.
Well, they did share certain left-wing sympathies, especially as the 30s went on, but their actual politics and their poetic styles were really quite different. Louis McNeice, for instance, was always much more skeptical of hardline communist dogma than the others were. But Auden was undoubtedly the center of gravity. He was the leader.
What was he like socially? I get the sense he was a bit of a character even back then.
Oh, absolutely. His friends described him as incredibly extravagant, very funny, and very generous, but also incredibly dogmatic.
A bit of a bully.
In an intellectual sense, maybe. In a group setting, he could be quite overbearing, holding court, telling everyone what was what. He would issue these pronouncements, tell his friends who they should date, what they should read, and exactly what was wrong with their latest poem.
But that was in public. What about in private?
That's the other side of the coin. In private, he was often shy and diffident, and according to his own letters, he was often incredibly lonely. It's that contradiction again. The loud, confident leader of the group who, deep down, felt isolated.
And it's at Oxford that he reconnects with Christopher Isherwood, which is a key relationship in his life.
The key relationship of his early life, certainly. They had met briefly at a prep school, but they properly reconnected in 1925 at Oxford, and it became what they called a sexual friendship that lasted for years, even while they were involved with other people.
But it was more than just a romance.
Oh, much more. They were collaborators in every sense of the word. Isherwood was the burgeoning novelist, Auden was the poet, and they critiqued each other's work brutally and intimately. Isherwood was the one who famously told Auden to stop being so obscure to clear up his language. Auden, even though he was the more famous one, often referred to Isherwood as his literary mentor.
It sounds like this really intense, creative, and personal incubator.
It was. So they leave Oxford, the roaring 20s are winding down, and the much darker decade of the 30s is looming. And Auden makes a crucial decision. He decides to go to Berlin.
Now, why Berlin? At that time, wasn't Paris the traditional spot for young, artistic expats?
It was. Paris was for the Romantics, for the lost generation. But this was 1928, and Berlin was for the realists. Berlin was the place to be if you wanted to escape what Auden saw as English repressiveness.
In what way?
Well, in a sexual sense, certainly. Auden was gay, and the Berlin of the Weimar Republic was famously liberal and experimental. It was far more open than London. But it was also a place of intense political and economic unrest.
Right. This is the Weimar Republic on the verge of collapse.
Yeah.
The Nazis are on the rise.
Exactly. This is where the political Auden is truly born. He sees the chaos firsthand. He sees the poverty, the street fighting between the communists and the Nazis, the decadence that comes with desperation. It's a massive wake-up call. He realizes that the polite, orderly English society he came from was living in a bubble, ignoring this massive storm gathering on the horizon.
It's interesting that he had to leave England to really understand what was happening in the world.
Yeah.
And yet, one of the most profound spiritual moments of his early 30s happens back in England, at a school. The vision of agape.
Yes.
You'll unpack that for us, because agape is a Greek word, isn't it?
It is. It refers to a kind of selfless, unconditional, brotherly love. It's distinct from eros, which is romantic or sexual love. And the story is really quite simple. It's 1933, and Auden is a schoolmaster at the Downs School. He's sitting on the lawn one evening with 3 of his fellow teachers. They're just talking, joking around. And suddenly, he has this overwhelming experience, this epiphany. He was overcome with the feeling that he loved them for themselves.
What does it mean exactly?
It meant their existence suddenly had infinite value to him, completely independent of what they could do for him or how they made him feel. It was a moment of pure, selfless connection. He saw their intrinsic worth.
That sounds almost mystical. Or religious.
It was. And even though he was an atheist at the time, he later looked back on that moment as a crucial turning point. It was a seed that years later would blossom into his return to the church. It was a break from that selfish alter ego kind of love he'd been chasing, looking for someone to complete him. And it was a glimpse of something universal.
A very profound experience. But before he fully gets back to the church, he's got a war to deal with, or a few wars, actually. The 1930s were heating up.
They were.
And Auden had this very strong philosophy that an artist had to be, and this is his phrase, more than a bit of a reporting journalist.
Right. He absolutely rejected the ivory tower. He believed the poet had to be down in the muck of the real world, reporting back from the front lines of history. And he really tried to live that.
And that includes his personal life,
Yeah.
right? In 1935, he does something quite extraordinary. He marries Erika Mann.
Yes. Thomas Mann's daughter, the great German novelist.
But this wasn't a love match.
Not in any conventional sense. It was a marriage of convenience, a purely political act.
Yeah.
The Nazis were in power in Germany, and they were stripping Erika, who was a vocal anti-fascist, of her German citizenship. She was in danger of becoming stateless.
So she needed a passport.
She needed the passport.
Yeah.
She first asked Christopher Isherwood if he would marry her to give her British citizenship. He declined, but he suggested Auden. And Auden, without having ever met her, Stokes agreed.
It's like that. Hey, want to get married to save me from the Nazis? Sure, why not?
Basically. They met for the first time at the registry office, got married, had a quick lunch, and then went their separate ways. They never lived together, but they remain lifelong friends and correspondents.
Wow.
It really highlights that underneath the enfant terrible persona, there was this deep well of private charity and moral seriousness. He was willing to use his privilege as a British citizen to help someone in a very tangible, practical way.
And then comes the Spanish Civil War.
Yeah.
1937. This was the great cause for the left in the 30s. Everyone who was anyone went. Hemingway, Orwell.
It was the defining political and moral test of that generation, and Auden felt he had to go. He went to Spain with the intention of driving an ambulance for the Republic.
He wanted to do something real, not just write poems about it.
Exactly. But the reality was a complete and utter disaster for him.
So.
Well, he wasn't driving an ambulance. As soon as he arrived, the Republican government recognized him and basically put him to work in their propaganda office.
Which he must have hated. He just fled a version of that in England.
He despised it. He felt totally useless. But more importantly, he was deeply disturbed by what he actually saw in Republican Spain. The political realities were not black and white, as he had imagined from London.
It wasn't just the good guys versus the bad guys.
Not at all. There was brutal infighting among the various left-wing factions, and as someone with that Anglican background, he was particularly shocked by the anti-clerical violence, the burning of churches, the execution of priests and nuns. It troubled him far more than he expected. He left after only about 7 weeks.
That's a very short time for such a major historical event.
It was a pivotal moment of disillusionment. He realized that war wasn't a stage for poetic heroics. It was a messy, ambiguous, and morally compromising business. He wrote a famous poem, Spain, to raise money for the cause, but he later came to absolutely hate that poem.
We're going to get to his habit of hating his own poems.
We are. He felt he was simplifying a complex tragedy just to score easy political points.
And he didn't stop there. He also went to China, right? To document the Sino-Japanese War.
Yes, that was in 1938, shortly after Spain. He went with Isherwood. They co-wrote a book called Journey to a War, so you can see he was really trying to live up to this ideal of the journalist poet. But by the end of that year, something had clearly shifted in him. He and Isherwood came back from China, they stopped in New York on their way home, and they made a decision that would change their lives and Auden's reputation forever.
And this brings us right to part 3, January 1939. The year of the so-called Great Betrayal.
That's what the British press called it, yes. In January of 1939, as war clouds are gathering over Europe, Auden and Isherwood sail for New York. They decide to leave Britain for good.
And the timing. I mean, you can't overstate how bad the timing looked. January 1939, Hitler's on the march. The Munich Agreement has already happened. War is seen as inevitable.
It's just a matter of months away.
And England's most famous, most politically engaged young poet packs his bags and leaves.
Exactly. It was seen as a profound act of cowardice, of abandoning the ship just as it was about to hit the iceberg. It created a massive scandal. It was even debated in Parliament.
In Parliament? Politicians were actually discussing a poet's travel plan.
They were, which tells you how central a figure he was. He was seen as a voice of his generation, a voice of the nation. And for him to leave at that precise moment was seen as an unforgivable betrayal.
His reputation in the UK must have taken a massive hit.
It was devastated. The writer Evelyn Waugh mercilessly satirized them as two cowardly poets named Parsnip and Pimpernel. The general consensus was that they were rats fleeing a sinking ship.
But what was Auden's perspective? Why did he feel he had to leave?
For him, it was a matter of artistic survival. He felt that Europe was creatively and spiritually dead. He believed that if he stayed in England, he would inevitably be co-opted by the war effort, forced to become a propaganda writer, something he'd already had a taste of and hated in Spain. He needed a new start to find his own authentic voice again.
And, crucially, in New York, he found a reason to stay. He met someone who anchored him there.
He met Chester Coleman. a young, aspiring poet from Brooklyn. And this relationship was fundamentally different from any that Auden had experienced before.
How so?
Remember we talked about him looking for an alter ego? Before Kalman, Auden's relationships tended to be with younger men or people he could mentor. They were often unequal. With Kalman, for the first time, he viewed it as a marriage between equals.
He actually used the word marriage.
He did. They exchanged rings. They went on a honeymoon trip across the country. For Auden, this was it. This was the real thing. But it hit a major crisis very quickly. In 1941, Kalman ended the sexual side of their relationship.
What happened?
Auden demanded total monogamy. He wanted a traditional, faithful marriage dynamic, and Kalman, who was much younger and more adventurous, simply couldn't or wouldn't accept that. Kalman was unfaithful, Auden discovered it, and he was completely heartbroken. There are accounts of him literally weeping in the streets of Ann Arbor.
But, and this is the really remarkable part, they didn't break up?
No, they didn't. And this is where that vision of agape comes back into play. Auden made a conscious, painful decision to love Kalman anyway. Their relationship transformed. They remained companions, sharing homes and collaborating on work for the rest of Auden's life.
That's an incredible commitment.
It is. He supported Kalman financially, he co-wrote several famous opera librettos with him, and he dedicated both editions of his collected poetry to two people, Christopher Isherwood and Chester Kalman. It became this model of lifelong companionship that defied any easy categorization.
It sounds like he was consciously building a new kind of family for himself in exile. Which brings us to the famous February house. I just love the mental image of this place.
It's the ultimate bohemian artist commune. It was a house at 7 Mitter Street in Brooklyn Heights.
And the list of residents is just unbelievable.
It's a fantasy dinner party lineup. You have Auden, the composer Benjamin Britten, the novelist Carson McCullers,
And Gypsy Rose Lee, the famous burlesque entertainer, all living under the same roof.
Can you just imagine the breakfast table conversation? A world-famous stripper, an avant-garde poet, and an opera composer all passing the toast. It was this incredible, chaotic hub of creativity.
And Auden was the ringleader.
He was a self-appointed house mother. He was the one organizing the finances and trying, mostly failing, to get people to do their chores. But while he was living this very bohemian, very public life, a profound internal shift was happening. In 1940, Auden formally returned to the Anglican Communion. He was confirmed into the Episcopal Church in America.
So the seed that was planted with the vision of agape finally bloomed.
It did. But it was also heavily influenced by his reading of the existentialist theologian Kierkegaard and his friendship with the writer Charles Williams. Auden's newfound Christianity wasn't retreat from the world, though. It was what you'd call an existential faith.
What do you mean by that?
It wasn't about pie in the sky when you die. It was about the here and now. It was about grappling with sin, with doubt, with the challenge of how to live a moral life in a fundamentally flawed, fallen world. And this pivot from the political concerns of the 30s to the spiritual and theological concerns of the 40s completely changed the focus and tone of his poetry.
Let's unpack that change in the work itself, because the critics definitely noticed, right? And they weren't all happy about it.
Oh, they noticed. And the critical world was completely divided. Many of his old admirers in England felt he'd gone soft. They missed the angry, urgent, political Auden of the 30s.
But his style was evolving, right? It wasn't just the subject matter.
Exactly. He moved away from that clipped, obscure, almost telegraphic style of his early poems, what some people called his secret agent style. He started using different forms, like syllabic verse, which he was inspired to use by the American poet Marianne Moore. He wanted to communicate more clearly. He wanted to be understood, not just admired for his cleverness.
And this is when he writes The Age of Anxiety, which is just a great title.
It's such a great title that it's become the shorthand for the entire post-war era. He wrote that long poem in 1947, and it won him the Pulitzer Prize. It's set in a bar in New York during the war, and it just perfectly captures that feeling of dislocation, of loneliness, of spiritual uncertainty. It was the poem that really solidified his status as a major American poet.
But this is also the period where he starts turning against his own earlier work. This is the whole controversy over the dishonest poems. He literally started rejecting some of his biggest hits.
This is one of the most fascinating and, I think, admirable things about him. Imagine a rock star refusing to play their #1 smash hit because they've decided they no longer agree with the lyrics.
That would never happen today.
Never. But Auden did it. He specifically targeted two of his most celebrated political poems, Spain and September 1st, 1939.
And September 1st, 1939 is the one that contains probably his most famous line, We must love one another or die.
That's the one. It's a beautiful, powerful, incredibly moving line. It was quoted everywhere, and Auden grew to absolutely hate it.
But why? It sounds so profound. It sounds like the ultimate moral truth.
Because, as he later pointed out with his relentless, obsessive logic, it's a lie.
A lie, how?
He said, we must die anyway. Whether we love one another or not, death is the one certainty for everyone. He felt that the line was, in his words, rhetorically effective but dishonest. He felt he was manipulating the reader with a sweet-sounding sentiment that wasn't, strictly speaking, factually true.
So he was prioritizing logical truth over emotional resonance.
He was prioritizing intellectual and moral integrity over popular effect. He tried to fix it at one point, changing the line to the much more logical, we must love one another and die.
Which is less catchy.
It's much less catchy, it's scientifically accurate, but it doesn't exactly make for an inspiring bumper sticker, so eventually he just gave up and scrapped the entire poem. He refused to allow it to be reprinted in his later collections.
That is a level of artistic integrity that is almost unheard of. Or maybe it's just stubbornness. But it shows how deeply he valued the truth of poetry. He refused to be a propagandist, even for a good cause like love.
Precisely. He refused to manipulate the reader with pretty lies. For him, poetry had a moral obligation to be truthful, and if he felt he had written something just to get an emotional response or to get applause, he felt it was dirty.
So he's scrubbing his past, he's living in New York, and then he discovers a new landscape that changes his work again, Italy.
Yes, in 1948, he begins spending his summers on the Italian island of Ischia. And this brings a new warmth, a new sensuousness to his poetry. The Mediterranean light and landscape seep into his work.
And he starts writing about new themes.
He does. He starts writing about the body, not as a sexual object or as a political tool for the state, but as a sacred, ordinary thing. Eating, sleeping, breathing. The mundane miracle of having a body. And he writes, In Praise of Limestone, which is an absolute masterpiece connecting the physical landscape of Ischia to the human condition.
What's the connection there? Why limestone specifically?
Well, think about what limestone is. It's a soft rock. It's porous. It's easily eroded by water. It creates caves and underground springs. Auden saw it as a metaphor for a certain kind of human nature. We are changeable. We are influenced by our environment. We're not rigid and unyielding like granite.
We're messy.
We're messy and soluble. And he argues that this weakness, this permeability, is actually what makes us capable of forgiveness, of love, of art, and ultimately of redemption.
That's beautiful. And eventually, he swaps his summer home in Italy for a permanent one in Austria.
Right. In 1958, he and Chester Coleman buy a small farmhouse in a village called Kirchstetten, Austria. And there's this very touching detail in his biography. When he signed the final papers, he shed tears of joy. It was the first time in his life at the age of 51 that he had ever owned his own home.
The great wanderer finally settles down.
He does. And this is where he becomes the curmudgeon in Austria. This is the period of his famously rigid routine. He lived his life entirely by the clock.
The contrast with his messy house?
Total contrast. He once said that cocktails were at 6.15 and dinner was at 7:30. And if you showed up at 6.17, he would scold you. Punctuality was a moral virtue for him.
But his actual living space was chaos.
Absolute chaos. Physical disorder everywhere. Books piled to the ceiling, dirty dishes, cigarette ash coating every surface. But the time was ordered. It's that contradiction again. He needed the external structure of a rigid timetable to manage the internal chaos of his mind. He once said, routine in an intelligent man is a sign of ambition. He meant that you need that framework to get the real work done.
And during this same period, he's also the professor of poetry at Oxford, right? So he's commuting back and forth.
Sort of. From 1956 to 1961, he held that prestigious post, but it only required him to be in residence and give 3 lectures a year. So he'd pop over to Oxford, give these incredibly popular, brilliant lectures, which eventually became his great book of prose, The Dyer's Hand, and then retreat back to his ordered life in Austria.
What was he like as a professor?
The students adored him. He was this disheveled, eccentric, chain-smoking, brilliant figure. He would sit in a cafe wearing old slippers and hold court, just like he did as a young man, but now with the authority and wisdom of age.
There's a line from a poem he wrote in this later period that I think just perfectly sums up his emotional life. If equal affection cannot be in point, let the more loving one be me.
That's from The More Loving One. It's just a heartbreaking and beautiful sentiment. And it really does encapsulate his relationship with Coleman and his whole mature philosophy on love.
It's an acceptance of imbalance.
It is. He accepted that love is rarely, if ever, perfectly balanced. And instead of growing bitter or resentful about it, he chose to embrace the role of the one who loves more. It's an act of choice, an act of grace. It's a commitment to love without demanding a perfect return on your investment.
That is a very long way from the young political revolutionary of the 30s who wanted to remake the world.
It is. It's the full arc of a life, the journey from trying to change the world to learning how to live in it with integrity and love.
So we come to the end, September 1973.
He's in Vienna. He's just given a reading of his poetry at the Palais Palffy for the Austrian Society for Literature. He goes back to his hotel with a friend. And that night, he dies in his sleep of heart failure. He was 66.
That feels quite young by modern standards.
It was. But he had lived a very hard life, decades of heavy smoking, heavy drinking, the constant intellectual and emotional stress of his work. His face was famously incredibly lined. He once compared his own face to a wedding cake left out in the rain.
A great line.
A great Auden line. He was buried in the village churchyard in Kirstetten, which shows how much that home meant to him. But, and here is that dual identity coming right back at the end. A year later, a memorial stone for him was placed in Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey.
So England claimed him back in the end.
They did. He belongs to both places. He's both the English poet and the American master.
So let's talk about his legacy, because it really has been a roller coaster. You mentioned earlier that some critics thought he was a complete washout.
Oh, the critical battles were fierce. The Scottish poet Hugh MacDiarmid called him a complete washout. The English poet Philip Larkin wrote a famous, rather nasty essay called What's Become of Wistan, which basically argued that Auden lost all his talent the moment he stepped on the boat to America.
So there was a real split.
A huge split. The British critics, by and large, tended to prefer the early political English Auden. They felt betrayed by the later religious American Auden. They thought he became too comfortable, too domestic, too philosophical.
But what about the Americans?
The next generation of American poets, people like John Ashbery and James Merrill, saw him as the modern master. His technical skill, his formal range, it was just staggering. In fact, you could argue that the Beat generation, Ginsberg, Kerouac, that whole movement, their wild, ecstatic, free verse style, was partly a direct reaction against Auden's pervasive formal influence.
You can't rebel against something unless it's the dominant force in the room.
Exactly. For a time, Auden represented the high bar of craftsmanship that everyone else had to either measure themselves against or consciously reject.
And then, years after his death, comes the great pop culture resurrection. 4 weddings and a funeral.
1994. The character Matthew, played by John Hannah, reads Funeral Blues, Stop All the Clocks. The movie becomes this massive, unexpected global hit, and suddenly everyone wants to read Auden. A small pamphlet of 10 of his love poems sold 275,000 copies in the UK alone.
That is an absolutely staggering number for a book of poetry.
It's unheard of. It brought him to a whole new generation who knew nothing about the Spanish Civil War or 1930s politics. They just connected with the raw, universal emotion of grief.
And isn't it ironic that the poem was originally written as a piece of satire?
It's the ultimate irony. The first version was a satiric eulogy for a political leader in a play he co-wrote called The Ascent of F6. He later rewrote it as a cabaret song to be sung by a soprano. And then, decades later, it becomes the world's most sincere and heartbreaking anthem of grief. It just shows how art can completely transcend an artist's original intention. Once it's out in the world, the audience decides what it truly means.
And then, unbelievably, it happens again. Another one of his poems has a huge resurgence after a tragedy. September 11th, 2001.
And this is the eeriest part of his legacy. After the attacks on the World Trade Center, that very poem he tried to delete, September 1st, 1939, went viral.
Before going viral was even really a thing.
Right, people started faxing it to each other, emailing it, reading it on the radio. Lines like, "The unmentionable odor of death offends the September night," just resonated with a terrifying power. It spoke to that specific, awful moment in a way nothing else could. It captured the fear, the confusion, and the sudden, desperate need for human connection.
So the poem he tried to kill because he thought it was dishonest ended up being the thing that felt most true to people in a moment of absolute crisis.
Exactly. It's the ultimate proof that once a poem is out in the world, it doesn't belong to the poet anymore. It belongs to us. We needed that poem in that moment, even if Auden himself had rejected it.
So if we step back and try to synthesize this whole complicated arc, the clever schoolboy, the political firebrand, the spiritual exile, the master craftsman. What's the core struggle at the heart of Auden's life and work?
I think Brodsky was right about him having the greatest mind of the century, but it was a mind in constant conflict with itself. The struggle was always between the public role of the poet and the private duty of the individual. He came to deeply distrust the idea of the great poet who could save the world with words.
He learned that poetry makes nothing happen.
As he famously wrote, he learned that politics are messy and that art ultimately can't stop a tank, so he turned his focus inward. He turned to the private moral duty of the individual. The duty to be truthful, to love your neighbor, to create order in your own small corner of the world, especially when the larger world is descending into chaos.
We must love one another and die.
Yes, acknowledging the bleak reality of our mortality, but choosing the difficult path of love anyway. For him, that was the only true, honest form of courage.
That brings us to a final thought for you, our listener. We've talked a lot about Auden deleting his most famous work because he felt it was rhetorically effective, but ultimately dishonest. He chose integrity over popularity.
Very high bar to set for oneself.
It is. So think about this in our current age, the age of influencers, of viral tweets, of content creators whose careers depend on engagement. Imagine this scenario. Would any modern creator delete their most popular, most shared, most viral post simply because they had a crisis of conscience and realized it wasn't strictly philosophically true?
Would they sacrifice the likes, the shares, the ad revenue for the sake of intellectual honesty?
It's a tough question. Auden did. It's something to think about. If you want to dive deeper into his world, go and read The Shield of Achilles or pick up his book of essays, The Dyer's Hand. You won't regret it.
Absolutely. Time well spent.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.